Welcome, everyone. My name is Atif Mia. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Before I do that, just some quick housekeeping notes. This session will go on till 5:45. This book talk is co-sponsored by the Griswold Center for Economic Policy and also the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. There's going to be a book signing opportunity at the end and a reception, which will be in the area where the Schultz cafeteria is, just behind this auditorium. Now, it's a great pleasure actually, and Alan, I'm not just saying that because you're sitting next to me, and I have to say nice things about you because since it's your thing, but I really mean it when I say this, that Alan is one of my favorite economists, and especially when it comes to macroeconomists. He's really up there in my view. The reason for that is that macroeconomics is somewhat of a strange field, that it's easy to get lost in the minutia, if you will. And I think Alan talks about that in his book as well. So it takes, I think, a real talent to understand what is truly relevant and what is not as relevant, and maybe more of a intellectual pursuit than a practical one. And I think Alan has always been very judicious in his judgment when it comes to figuring out what is truly relevant and what is not. And I think for that reason, among others, his work, academic work, has been extremely influential in shaping the thinking of people not only in academia, where it's obviously tremendous by every metric, but also on the policy side, he has been extremely influential. He's also one of those rare individuals who's not only been, checked all the boxes of success on the academic side of things, but at the same time, he has been, his role in public service has been extremely large. He has served under President Clinton in the Council of Economic Advisors from January 1993 to 94. And then he also served in the Federal Reserve as vice chairman of the US Fed from 1994 to 1996. Many people in the public know Alan as a prolific author. He has written many books on the broader topic of US macroeconomics, and his new book is no exception. So it's really a privilege to hear him speak about his terrific new book, Monetary and Fiscal Policy, a 6-year saga. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Atif, for the introduction. I wish half of that was true. I think, it was close. It's very nice to be here among some of my students I've seen come in, but also among old friends. When you're an old guy, you have old friends. And it doesn't take any more proof than me standing here to know you're listening to an old guy. So I actually lived through most of this 60-year saga that I'm going to speak about today. This is an academy, so I'm going to start. This is not an academic book, but I want to start with a kind of an academic framing, just a framing, and then we'll get on to history. If you think about a simple economics 101 framework for macroeconomic policy, often called stabilization policy, there are two branches of it. The fiscal branch is controlled by the President and Congress. The monetary branch in the United States is controlled by the Federal Reserve. And they don't do exactly the same thing, but in terms of moving aggregate demand, they're similar. If aggregate demand is too high and we're worried about inflation, you look for contractionary policies from one or both of those authorities. If aggregate demand is too low and we're worried about unemployment, you look for expansionary policy moves by one or both of those authorities. So it says on the bottom bullet point that's on the screen. Now, you might think, you might naively think that the two policies typically cooperate and share the job. But in the immortal words of Richard Nixon, though in a different context, that would be wrong. Instead, as you follow the ebbs and flows of monetary and fiscal policy in the U.S., and I don't think the U.S. is completely unique in this, by the way, but I'll only talk about the U.S. Over this 60-year period, you find episodes in which there was cooperation. They looked like they were working together. Episodes in which they were like this, banging heads, one against the other. And episodes in which one ignored the other, more or less, and just sort of did its thing. So you have all kinds of interactions of that sort. Not much giving the impression this is like one unified authority working together. Not much of that. So there are a number of themes in it. I mean, this is a 400-page book, and I'm going to give you about a 40-page lecture on it, so I'm not going to try to cover everything. There are three major themes in this book, which just came out this month, by the way. Excuse me. And a number of sub-themes. The one I'm going to emphasize, and it's bolded on the screen right now, is the question of, in this orchestra, who's playing first violin and who's relegated to second fiddle. That has changed a lot in U.S. history over this 60 years, and I'm going to sort of trace a lot of that, including the reasons for it. As sub-themes, that will lead me naturally into talking about changing attitudes towards budget deficits, which is what fiscal policy does. It generally either raises or lowers the budget deficit, and towards Federal Reserve independence. How are these two branches of stabilization policy interacting? So you'll see those are sub-themes in what I'm going to do. So I start the story at the beginning. My book starts in 1961, when Keynes came to America in the Kennedy administration. Now, what was different about the Kennedy, it's hard for us to think, especially for young people now, 1961 was a long time ago, it's hard to think about what was, quote, revolutionary in 1961. After all, Keynes wrote the general theory in 1936. But Kennedy was a real break from the pre-Keynesian orthodoxy, as it says here, in his advocacy of a large tax cut, despite the fact that we had a budget deficit, not a surplus, and the economy was recovering from a recession, not falling into a recession. The orthodoxy then was he didn't do things like that. It was a real break with precedent, and Congress didn't exactly greet it with equanimity. This is another thing that's hard to imagine given the history of the United States since the 1980s. Just imagine a president saying to the Congress, I want you to cut taxes, and the Congress saying, I don't think I want to do that. I mean, it's been a long time since we've seen that kind of reaction in Congress. But Kennedy did do it, and only after his assassination, well after his assassination, did Lyndon Johnson manage to get it passed. And the words I put on the slide suggest we can't rerun history, but I have a lot of skepticism that that tax cut ever would have passed were it not for the assassination of Kennedy. That's another measure of how things have changed since then. Finally, on this slide, the big deal at that time was fiscal policy. So I said Keynes came to America. That could have been monetary policy. That could have been fiscal policy. The big deal, the first violinist in the first Keynesian orchestra in America was fiscal policy, for sure. Monetary policy, and this is where that word comes from, was supposed to accommodate the tax cut. Accommodate. Federal Reserve still talks about accommodative monetary policy. Very few people know that's where the term originated. If the Federal Reserve did nothing, boosting the budget deficit by cutting taxes, we're probably going to push up interest rates. And the Fed was supposed to lean against that. That was the idea. That was so much the idea, I've got too many buttons here, that here, the economists in the room will especially appreciate the incredible irony of this quotation, which I found in researching the book from the Economic Report of the President in 1968. I'm going to read it with a pause. It has been and remains the conviction of both the administration and the Federal Reserve System. First pause. What? This is a joint statement from the White House and the Federal Reserve that they agree on whatever is going to come next in the paragraph? We haven't seen anything like that in decades. But it seemed natural in 1968. And then comes the next part, which you've already read, that the nation should depend on fiscal policy, not monetary policy, to carry the main burden of the additional restraint on the growth of demand, blah, blah, blah. Inflation was the problem of the day, as it is today. Today, nobody on earth thinks that fiscal policy is going to be the remedy for inflation. Everybody thinks the whole burden is on monetary policy. But this is what both the White House and the Federal Reserve thought and wrote in 1968. And there was nary a thought about central bank independence in this statement. And not much thinking about it at the time. Finishing the story of Kennedy and Johnson, Johnson becomes president after the assassination. He wants to pursue the Great Society programs, which is a lot of government spending, and the war in Vietnam, which was really a lot of government spending, on top of an economy that was pretty much at full employment at the time. So it was a classic case of excess demand driving up inflation, and that's what happened. And that was the reason for this, let me go back one, saying fiscal policy's got to act against inflation. Inflation was the problem. And fiscal and monetary cooperation at that point turned into a confrontation between Johnson and Martin. I didn't mention William McChesney Martin, it was in the title, was the chairman of the Fed at the time. And by the way, the longest serving chairman of the Fed ever, edging out Alan Greenspan. Those were the two longest serving. So there was then a fairly sharp confrontation between Johnson and Martin. Johnson showed that he had some knowledge of U.S. monetary history by saying in some, I'm not remembering now, it's in the book where this quote came from, by saying that he was prepared to be Jackson, that's Andrew Jackson, if he, Martin, the head of the Fed, wants to be Biddle, that's Nicholas Biddle. The so-called bank wars in the 1930s were over renewing the charter of what was then the second bank in the United States, headed by Biddle. Biddle, of course, wanted it renewed. Jackson wasn't too keen on centralized power, banking, Biddle, or anything like that. And we all know who won that battle. It was Jackson, and we had no central bank in this country from then until 1914. LBJ apparently knew about that. I'm not sure I'd want to quiz too many modern politicians on that issue. And in addition, one day he invited Martin down to Texas to barbecue him. LBJ used to do friendly barbecues frequently. This was not a very friendly barbecue. You know the old thing that if you don't know who's the mark, you're the mark? I think Martin knew who was the mark when he went there, but you don't say no to the President of the United States. He showed up, and Johnson chewed him out for being tough on monetary policy while, as Johnson put it, boys are dying in Vietnam. He also inquired whether he could fire Martin, and the answer was the same answer Donald Trump got many years later, which is no, you don't have the authority to do that. So Johnson finally requested, his Keynesian advisors had been arguing this for years, a tax increase to try to act against inflation. Remember that early slide. Fiscal policy was supposed to combat inflation. Congress looked at that and didn't like it too much either. It took 18 more months before it finally passed in 1968. And one thing that struck me in assembling this history of a monetary and fiscal policy over 60 years, that was 1968. That was the last time a fiscal contraction was ever motivated by what my first Economics 101 slide said, to try to get control of aggregate demand in the downward direction to fight inflation. There have been fiscal contractions since then, but always motivated, as you'll see in the coming slides, by controlling the ogre of the budget deficit, not to manage aggregate demand. Moving down in time, the next episode of interest is, I call it the notorious episode with Nixon in the White House and Arthur Burns running the Fed. Nixon and Burns had a long-standing political friendship going back to the Eisenhower days or earlier. That got sorely tested in this episode. Modern economists have written a lot of theoretical work about fiscal dominance. This was a much more direct, obvious, unsubtle form of fiscal dominance. Nixon thought he should control Burns, and therefore to control monetary policy. There was no thought about central bank independence at all, and Burns went along, basically. So the economic part of the Nixon re-election program in 1972 was highly expansionary fiscal policy coupled with highly expansionary monetary policy, and it really juiced up the economy. Those of you with a nodding acquaintance with American economic history at the time, excuse me, pardon me, will remember there were price controls put on in 1971, so that put a lid on it for a while, then the lid came off. Generally, Burns was cooperative with Nixon, to put it mildly. The major supply shocks then followed that, and at first there were price controls, but later there weren't, and the nation suffered its first burst into double-digit inflation as the price controls disappeared. Here's a graph showing, you can see the colors. The blue line is the all items consumer price index, the rate of change, the inflation rate measured by the CPI. And the red line is what economists call the core rate of inflation, excluding food and energy. And you can see they're sort of trundling along, looking a lot alike each other until the supply shocks start hitting in I can't touch the screen, in 73, 74. And there's a very wide divergence at that point. That happens again later in history, and I'm going to come to that shortly. Well, now, actually, these initial supply shocks that started in 1972-3 created in the minds of fiscal and monetary policy makers, and maybe academics, but I think less so, actually, a lot of confusion because it wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to be living in a world where if the economy was running on all cylinders, overheating, you got low unemployment and you got high inflation. And if it was the other way around, if we were in a slump and there weren't so many jobs and demand was weak, we got low inflation along with the low performance of the real economy. You were not supposed to get inflation rising and unemployment rising at the same time. So this was a new phenomenon at the time. We're now familiar with it. It was very new then, and it's hard for people living in 2022 to imagine how much this confused policymakers at the time. But here's a very clear metric. The president at this point is no longer Nixon, it's Ford. Jerry Ford asked Congress to raise taxes in October 1974 to fight inflation. Remember what I said before is 1968 was the first actual tax hike to fight inflation. Ford asked for one, he didn't get it. And within a few months he had reversed himself and came back to Congress and asked for a tax cut to fight unemployment. And that one he got. So October 74 to January 75, that's a fairly small increment of time, and it's reflective of the confusion, like what am I supposed to do now on fiscal policy? Monetary policy is a little harder. I would have to show you a whole bunch of graphs on interest rates and money, and I'm not going to do that, but suffice it to say that Burns also vacillated quite a bit in this period. So the federal funds rate, the principal measure of monetary ease or tightness, drifted up slowly while Nixon was running for election, despite inflation going up a lot, and then rapidly thereafter. Then it went down and up and down. See graph. Here's the graph. If you look at the left-hand side of this graph, what you see in 1972, slowly rising interest rates, you can perceive an acceleration in the rise in interest rates once Nixon has won the 1972 election, and then it's down and up and down. As Arthur Burns and the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, are wondering, what in the world do we do with this new phenomenon of stagflation? And they didn't know what to do. So fiscal policy got confused, monetary policy got confused. I might add as a little commercial, a number of very good academic economists were not confused. And Bob Gordon of Northwestern and Ned Phelps, who's now at Columbia, wrote very early on what to do about understanding this and what you might do about it. But in the policy domain, it was not well understood at all. So moving now through history, the next episode is Jimmy Carter, who I think can clearly be classified as the bad luck president. Some people will say he was the bad policy president. I'll come to that. But he certainly had more than his share of bad luck. So Carter becomes president in January 77. Remember, the economy had a very big slump in 75. It's still coming out of that slump. Carter and his team decided they needed some fiscal stimulus. That might not have been such a great decision, but it wasn't very much that he asked for. And one reason, this was one of my sub-themes, is Carter was a bit like Eisenhower, not quite, in his hatred of deficits, thinking how awful they were, maybe even immoral. Carter, if those of you remember Jimmy Carter, he was very much a moralist. And to him, this was a bad thing to do. But he sort of bit the bullet a little bit and said the economy could use a boost, and let's recommend one to Congress. And he got a small fiscal stimulus through Congress. He replaced Arthur Burns at the Fed by G. William Miller, a name that has been all but forgotten in Federal Reserve history. He didn't serve there very long. He's not considered a very good leader of the Fed, largely because of what happened with inflation. It was happening before his watch. It happened a lot on his watch, and of course continued into Paul Volcker's watch. I think the charge may be a little bit tough on Miller. It's basically right that he was too soft on inflation, but as it says here, during his brief period at the helm of the Fed, the central bank raised the federal funds rate by about 450 basis points. So that's not trivial. That's not nothing. It was not enough to do the job, and that's the criticism Miller has gotten through history. But a lot of casual history is written like Miller ignored inflation and wasn't paying attention, and it's all his fault. All the bad inheritance of Paul Volcker was his fault. I think that's a little tough on G. William. It says, see previous graph. You can see that here. If you look at the bottom on the federal funds rate in early 1977, a year later, Burns is replaced by Miller, and you can see the federal funds rate rising at a fairly reasonable clip, not like Volcker, he came later, but not at the rate that somebody who was ignoring inflation would have done it. So it's a little bit of a bad historical rap for Miller. Coming back to current events in Carter, things got much worse in 1979 on the inflation front when OPEC struck again. Carter felt boxed in by inflation, which was clearly the biggest national problem. Does that sound familiar, by the way? At the time, and turned to Paul Volcker, who had an absolute rock-solid reputation as somebody who A, hated inflation, and B, would do something about it if given the chance. He had dissented, not dissented, he had argued frequently against Miller. When Miller was chairman and he was the president, Volcker was president of the New York Bank, that the Fed should be doing more on raising interest rates. So the point of this is it was not a surprise to Jimmy Carter or to the Carter team that they were going to get a much tougher monetary policy when they replaced Miller by Volcker. Carter knew that. He understood that this might cost him the White House, and he did it anyway. So, I mean, to me, that's a pretty good politician. You don't see that a lot. And in addition to Carter putting Volcker in the job, he did not browbeat Volcker because Volcker was being too tough. Remember, this followed Nixon and Burns. The Carter and Volcker relationship was entirely different. There was Carter hiring Volcker and giving you this job, go kill inflation. And I'm going to go back to the White House and not say anything. I don't think he actually said those words to Paul Volcker. But that's basically what he did. Now, on bad policy, a little remembered episode is the second quarter of 1980. So Jimmy Carter is still president of the United States. He invokes credit controls, which had been left over from a previous law. A lot of people had forgotten about it, but he had the authority. And in particular, the reason I put controls in quotes is the big control there was Carter exhorting American consumers to put away or even rip up their credit cards and stop using them. Now, we laugh at that now. Because, I mean, just imagine if Joe Biden got on the air and said, rip up your credit cards. You know exactly what would happen. But in those days, a lot of people ripped up their credit cards and mailed them to the White House. And consumer spending just cratered. Boom, just like that. 1980 second quarter was one of the worst quarters in the GDP history of the United States, eclipsed, of course, by 2020 second quarter, but not by many others. It was an 8% annualized rate of decline for a single quarter. That's a big recession all by itself in a single quarter. Stu Eisenstadt, in his biography of Carter, called that a monumentally bad idea, which it certainly was. Volcker didn't like it much, but he decided that Carter was being such a good guy in supporting, by not saying anything, the excruciatingly tight money coming out of the Fed, that he couldn't say to Carter, I'm not doing that. The Fed was put in charge of these credit controls, so they tried to make them as meaningless as they could. Another misreading of history, which I've heard a number of times in recent months, looks at that second quarter. Let me go back to a graph you had up before. If you look here, and you can see 1980, can you read the legend? In the second quarter of 1980, the federal funds rate plummets. Really a big downward movement. And a number of people have said Volcker lost his nerve in the second quarter of 1980. No. If you know Paul Volcker, he never lost his nerve. He would never lose his nerve. He didn't lose his nerve. The economy was going to hell in a handbasket. It was falling at rates that no one had seen since the 1930s. So should the Fed still have been jacking up interest rates in an environment like that? Volcker didn't think so. And I, for what it's worth, think he was right. So that's why the Fed did this, quote, reversal, as it's mistakenly sometimes called. Once that was over, Volcker went back to raising interest rates. The next president for Paul Volcker, however, wasn't as cooperative as Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan came in, and we had the really epic clash, the most epic clash in U.S. history anyway, between the two branches of policy. So remember what I said at the beginning. You've got these two branches of policy that can move aggregate demand, and you might think they'll go together, both pushing it up or both pulling it down. Well, we got the exact opposite of that in the Reagan period. Volcker had been tightening monetary policy since late 1979. After that blip in the second quarter of 80, he went back to raising interest rates a lot. Let me show you that. There, you see after that big downdraft in this gray shaded area, interest rates are shooting up again, which is where Volcker thought they needed to be. Reagan came in, and the tax cuts, the massive tax cuts passed in 1981 and began to be effective in 1982. So what do you have? You have very tight monetary policy and very loose fiscal policy colliding with one another. What did we get? Well, first of all, there was the timing issue. Volcker had the first whack at the piñata, and we had a very big slump in 81, 82. The Reagan team didn't like that very much. In case you think Reagan was always a super popular president, back then he wasn't. His approval numbers were really low. That's what happens to presidents in recessions. But then first of all, Volcker eased up. The Fed eased up, said that was enough. We got inflation down to where we wanted. And the Reagan tax cuts came online, and that's what led to mourning in America. So a tremendously rapid economic growth in 1984, starting in 83 and 84 and dribbling into 85. A little known fact, by the way, is that the growth rate over the entire Reagan presidency, 8 years, is almost exactly the same as over the 4-year Carter presidency. The myth, the historical myth, is that the U.S. economy struggled under Carter and did great under Reagan. Well, that's only true if the same number, 3-point-something% average growth rate, can be both terrible and great. I have a hard time seeing how that could be true. Now, economic textbooks, I write one, tell you that if you have a policy mix of tight money and loose fiscal policy, you should get very high real interest rates, and we did. That should cause the dollar to soar in world markets, which it did. And that, this may not be in the textbooks, will decimate American manufacturing. In case you're wondering, this is the period of time in which the phrase Rust Belt came into common parlance. That's when these factories started rusting in the American Midwest. And the reason was simple. It was that the dollar went up so much that it just priced American manufacturing goods out of world markets. So that was part of the legacy of that clash. The Reagan presidency, of course, left the fiscal legacy of very large budget deficits, and that became the focus, you'll see in the next couple of slides, of fiscal policy thereafter. And then there's this interesting historical question of whether Reagan fired. Did he jump or was he pushed? Paul Volcker was equivocal about whether he wanted another term. He served 8 years, 8 hard years, and was up for either reappointment or not in 1987. His old friend from Princeton, Jim Baker, who was fairly influential with Ronald Reagan, wasn't too keen on that. Paul Volcker was not the sort that bent to the will of the President of the United States, and Jim Baker thought that wasn't so great for the President of the United States. So there was a lot of up and back, and eventually Reagan decided not to reappoint Volcker. Volcker, as I said, was equivocal about whether he wanted another 4 terms or not. My firm guess as an amateur historian is he would have taken another 4 years, and the guess is based on his tremendous devotion to public service. So I think he would have, but We don't know. It was not offered to him, and he was replaced by Alan Greenspan, as you know. H.W. Bush, Bush the first, followed, and probably all of you, except the young ones in the room, will remember no new tax, read my lips, no new taxes. That was part of his presidential campaign. I'm not raising taxes. Let me back up a second. The big problem, well, it says here on the first line, the big problem left to fiscal policy was the legacy of the chronic deficits from the Reagan administration, which meant that no one was thinking of fiscal policy any longer as a stabilization tool. They were all thinking about how in the world could we shrink this budget deficit. So it's striking that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, when the 1990-91 recession hit, said we ought to have a tax cut to get out of this recession. Nobody thought that. I dug up, or my research assistant dug up, I should give credit where credit is due, this quotation out of the New York Times in December 91. Many of the president's economists, that's George Bush the first economist, along with much of the economics establishment, fear that economic stimulus of any kind is as likely to harm as help. Wow, that's in a recession? That's, as I wrote here, this is not part of the New York Times quote. That's about as anti-Keynesian as you can possibly get. We have a recession. How do we react to the recession? We got to cut the budget deficit. Now, George Bush had pledged that if they were going to cut the budget deficit, it was not going to be by raising taxes. And that wound up costing him. Politically, if I finish up the George Bush story, that's repeating from before. Fiscal policy then became about reducing the deficit. Bush agreed with the Democrats in the 1990 budget summit to raise taxes. It wasn't that big a tax hike, but it was a tax hike, and he had promised there wasn't going to be a tax cut. That cost him politically. He also agreed, and this is much less, that first point is discussed in economic history ad infinitum. The second point is not, and I think it was much more important. That budget agreement in 1990 put in the pay-go system, pay as you go. What did that mean? It meant budget balance at the margin. It meant that any bill in Congress that was going to raise the budget deficit, say by cutting taxes or spending more, had to have a companion with it that would, quote, pay for it. So with higher taxes or with lower spending somewhere else. It didn't order balancing the budget. It ordered balancing the budget at the margin. The changes, the deltas, had to be balanced. And I call this the sleeper in the 1990 budget accord. It was something between ignored and maligned at the time, and it turned out to be a very, very big deal in getting the budget deficit down. And George Bush the first deserves credit for going along with that. Finally, to this theme of monetary and fiscal policy, the George Bush the first administration continued what had by then become standard fare in administrations talking about the Fed, to beat up on the Fed, to complain about the Fed every time it raised interest rates. And as it says here, George Bush wound up blaming Greenspan for losing the election to Bill Clinton in 1992. Again, we can't rerun history, but he had a point there. He certainly had a point there. Okay, I've already mentioned Bill Clinton. There are a lot of things you could say about Bill Clinton. I worked for Bill Clinton, by the way, so I'm not completely unbiased in this. That's a confession. But there are two major things that are worth talking about in this context. First is that the deficit reduction, which began under the first George Bush, got much more serious under Bill Clinton, who really devoted his economic policy to getting the budget deficit down, even though there were still nagging concerns about the strength of the economy. This is before the Clinton boom. The Clinton years are known as the boom years. That came mostly in his second term. in his first term, especially early in his first term, I was part of the administration then, were a little bit worried about the strength of the recovery and getting back to full employment. Clinton decided to take the gamble. He was warned by his economic advisors, one of whom was me, but I wasn't the only one, that it was a gamble. Cutting the budget deficit means either you're going to raise taxes or cut government spending. Either one was going to take a bite out of aggregate demand and could slow the economy down. Clinton heard all that and decided to go ahead anyway, and he spoke. I wish I could get inside his head and know if he actually believed this. I think he did. I know what he said. I can't get inside his mind and think what was going through his mind. But he certainly spoke as if the fiscal multiplier was negative. He talked about we're going to cut the budget deficit in order to grow the economy. You think about that, if you've had any economics, that's a negative fiscal multiplier. You cut the budget deficit either by pushing up taxes or pulling down spending. That's not supposed to make the economy grow faster. But it might if interest rates go down. So the second big deal for Bill Clinton about fiscal and monetary policy was the mantra, we don't comment on the Fed. So it says right below that, if this policy was going to work, the Clinton policy of growing the economy by reducing the budget deficit, interest rates had to go down. And that means either that the Fed was going to cut short-term rates or at least forbear, not raise them. They were pretty low. Or the bond market was going to rally and the bond rate was going to come down. The market was going to do that. And Clinton understood this. His advisors, explained this to him, including the fact that it was a gamble. We couldn't guarantee that that would happen. Well, the bond market rally did happen big time, and that gave impetus to the economy that the deficit reduction was taking out. The Fed did not cut interest rates, and its forbearance, holding I remember the rate, it was a 3% federal funds rate. At the time, a low rate, because inflation was also 3%. So the real federal funds rate was 0. This forbearance only lasted until February 1994, which is when the Fed started getting worried about incipient inflation and pushing up interest rates. It doesn't say this on the slide. Clinton was livid. He literally turned red. His attitude was, look, I just almost suffered political death because he almost lost the budget in Congress by cutting the budget deficit. By the way, by the amount Greenspan said I should cut it. That's an aside. And now he turns around and raises interest rates. This is what Bill Clinton said inside the White House. What did he say outside the White House? Nothing. Nothing. Not one sentence of criticism of the Fed. And all of us that were working for him had to memorize the mantra that you see there. Whenever we were asked by a journalist about the Fed, we said, we don't comment on the Fed. Everybody said that, from Clinton on down to me. It was all the same story. I give him an incredible amount of credit for that. And it was a huge and unappreciated change from what had happened under previous presidents. I went through some of that. George Bush before, Nixon, Johnson, they had all beat up on the Fed. It was kind of considered your political right? If things are going wrong with the president, with the economy, blame the Fed. It's not me, it's those bad guys. Clinton never did that. That was a big, big change. And of course, he turned the budget deficits into surpluses, which didn't last long. You know who came after Clinton? George Bush II, whose idea about the budget deficit was, he never said this, is it could never be too big, or something like that. He came in immediately with so-called supply-side tax cuts, not as big as Reagan's, but sizable. He followed that, let me just put this next, by getting rid of PAYGO. PAYGO was kind of nasty. if you want to spend without anything bad coming with it, and he did. So there was a war going on that he wanted to prosecute. There was Medicare Part D, the drug benefit, and there were several other things. None of that was paid for in the Bush administration. And of course, the deficit exploded. And he had his vice president, Dick Cheney, saying Reagan proved deficits don't matter. I think he meant it politically. By the way, for those of you aficionados in the audience, nowadays a number of economists are saying that economically. But Cheney, I think, meant it politically. There's no price to pay for pushing up the budget deficits. So between the tax cuts and getting rid of PAYGO, which was in the way, the Bush administration, Bush II, quickly turned the Clinton surpluses into Bush deficits. Near the end of the Bush administration, the financial crisis struck, and that, of course, really blew the deficit for two obvious reasons. The economy was tanking, and the government had to come in and try to do something. This episode was not like 90-91. Both the fiscal policy and the monetary policy responded in the anti-recessionary ways that you might have expected. The Bush response was modest, and of course it was a tax cut. What else? The Fed responded very vigorously. This is the Fed now under Ben Bernanke, dropping the interest rates. I put zero in quotes. The Fed has never been willing to actually get to zero, but very, very low. Almost zero. Put in this alphabet soup of agencies to provide liquidity and lending, all of which then disappeared later. Really a long list, about this long, of emergency facilities, and followed by QE as quantitative easing for years after that. So we had both. So here's an instance where both policies are pushing in the same direction, with clearly monetary policy sitting in first chair and fiscal policy picking up the rear. That's what it says. I'm almost at the end of the story. I'm up to Obama and Bernanke, who were left to pick up the pieces after the Great Recession, the worst recession since the 1930s, which really got terrible after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in September 2008. The big stimulus act was called the Recovery Act. It passed. Remember, Obama's elected in January. Obama takes office in January 2009. In February 2009, he manages to get the Congress on a completely partisan vote. Well, there were I think he got a couple of Republicans, but basically a partisan vote to pass the Recovery Act, which was seen at the time as a massive, gigantic fiscal stimulus. It was about 5% of GDP. That looks like a piker compared to what happened in the pandemic period. It did not look like a piker then. It was the biggest fiscal stimulus in American history to that point. It's been criticized now and recently for being too small to do the job. And so you hear the story, and there's truth to it, that this was too small to do the job, and therefore both Trump and Biden had to go bigger to do the bigger job in the pandemic. But it was a big one, and my guess is it was as big as you could have gotten through Congress. It barely got through Congress. The Republicans John Boehner was the Speaker of the House at the time, were opposed to it, calling it job-killing government spending. I'd like to parse those words with you for a second. I've done this since then with many audiences. Job-killing government spending. Now, government spending can be inefficient, stupid, on the wrong things, poorly administered, bad in many dimensions. How can it kill jobs? When the government spends money, it's either hiring people to do things, policemen, school teachers, soldiers, or it's buying things from private industry, who are in turn employing workers. Now, you could think that the spending is foolish, that we shouldn't do it. But job-killing government spending? I don't think that makes any sense. But that was part of the mantra of the Republican Party then. Worse yet, and partly because of that, You'll remember, I think 2010 was a wave election against Obama and the Democrats. So now the Republicans are in charge of the Congress. And they turned fiscal policy contractionary for several years running, and not by trivial amounts. This is another thing that's not well known. The fiscal contraction in the years 2011, 12, and 13 running was about 1.5% per year. Per year. That's a 4.5% fiscal contraction, almost exactly what the Recovery Act had put in as a fiscal expansion in 2009. Those are very big numbers. Obama wasn't happy. He kept asking the Congress to put a little more support for the economy. And Ben Bernanke crossed the line between monetary policy and fiscal policy, and himself, he couldn't do anything about it, he didn't have a vote in Congress. He himself voiced many, many times the need for more fiscal stimulus to help the Fed. He basically said, this is a big job, we can't do it by ourselves. We need some fiscal help. He didn't get it. So the Fed again became the only game in town when it came to stabilization policy. Trump. Trump started his presidency with a very large tax cut on top of what we thought was a fully employed economy. This reminded a lot of people that were old enough, I was, of what LBJ did in 1965. We're already at full employment. Why are we stimulating the economy more? The 65 episode did lead to a higher inflation. The 2017 episode did not. I've almost said ironically, but it's not ironically at all. When Trump was a candidate in the 2016 election, he screamed at the Federal Reserve, then chaired by Janet Yellen, for being too loose with monetary policy to try to help the Democrats win the election. As soon as he became president, he started screaming at the Fed, now led by his own appointee, Jerome Powell, for being too tight with monetary policy. That is not ironic. That's exactly what you would expect. And in another similarity to LBJ, he said he wanted to fire Powell. And he talked to enough lawyers that convinced him that he didn't have the authority to fire Powell. In 2020, the Congress passed this gigantic CARES Act, which is like 10% of GDP, totally dwarfing the Obama stimulus. And Trump supported it. I don't think he had much to do with arranging it, but he certainly was supportive. The Fed, for its part, did everything it did in 2008 and then more. So I wrote through the kitchen sink at the recession. Some of it in the CARES Act, which interestingly directed the Fed to do some things. So this was a kind of a small violation of central bank independence. The Fed was not chafing at the bit. It was willing to do these things. I'm talking about small business lending and buying corporate bonds and things like that, that were way out of the Fed's comfort zone, but the Fed was willing to go there. So again, we had both policies working strongly together to try to solve a mega problem of a gigantic recession. And I'll skip. And then at the end of 2020, there was another stimulus bill, and you'll remember this, I think. Trump wanted a bigger checks than the Republicans wanted. The bill passed with only 600. Trump screaming, you should have done 2,000. That was music to the Democrats' ears. They picked, 2,000, we'll run on that. Elect Democrats and we'll give you the other 1,400 to get the 600 up to 2,000 where Trump said it should be. And that's, of course, what happened in the ARP, the American, and other things, in the ARP in March of 2021. That bill, the Biden stimulus, was criticized at the time for being too large, and it's being criticized even more now for being too large and being a contributing cause of inflation. Notably, unlike Reagan, Volcker, the Fed did not try to offset this. Right? The Fed could have looked at that and said, that's too much. We're going to try to offset it with higher interest rates. They did not. So we did not have a repeat of Reagan, Volcker, and in fact, the Fed kept interest rates at essentially zero for another year, which is a policy error, and they're paying the price, and we're paying the price for that. Now, the last note is just that Biden went back to, the Biden people don't come around saying we don't comment on the Fed like a robot, like we did in the Clinton administration, but that's been their policy. They don't complain about the Fed, including not blaming them for inflation. If you ask 99 out of 100 economists who's the bigger, which is more at fault for the high inflation we have, fiscal policy or monetary policy, almost everybody will say monetary policy. But you don't hear Joe Biden pointing the finger at the Fed, saying it wasn't me, it was them. So we're back to Federal Reserve independence. Okay, last slide. A super short summary. I said there were 3 themes that I would talk about, concentrating on the first. Is monetary or fiscal stabilization the lead actor in this game? In 61, it was clearly fiscal. By 2022 and well before, it was clearly monetary. But lots of up and downs. This is not a trend. That's why I took you through this whole story. Many ups and downs in whether we're relying on fiscal policy or relying on monetary policy. Attitudes towards deficits are a little bit more linear, not quite linear, going from they're horrible things that we want to avoid in 1961. Kennedy broke that taboo, to now I'm looking around the room, we have people of very different ages. The old people will all remember Alfred E. Newman and Mad Magazine, as I do. What me worry. That's the attitude about budget deficits now. Very different from 1961. And finally, central bank independence, which was an afterthought, if indeed it was a thought at all, back in 1961. You remember that statement, the White House and the Fed saying the same thing at the same time. To the view now, at least among economists, and I think more than just economists, that it's critical to getting good macroeconomic policy. And that's mostly a trend. The belief in the importance of central bank independence has mostly been trending up over these 60 years. And that brings me to the end of the story. Thank you. I guess I will referee the Q&A, right? Mike. I guess you should identify yourself so people know. So people know you know of what you speak, Michael.
I want to go back to the Great Inflation from 65 to 82. And I want to know why did it happen? Why did the Fed drop the ball? Can you tell us your story on the Great Inflation?
Well, I thought I did. So let me go briefly. In 65, the Fed saw inflation as a danger and started raising interest rates. They got beaten down by Johnson. Then they went back to it. So some people really criticize Martin for not doing enough, and probably he didn't do enough. But you need to appreciate how hard it is for a Fed chief who's being beaten publicly by the President of the United States to do what Paul Volcker later did, and he didn't. So the inflation cat got out of the bag. Then it was boosted by 2 episodes of supply shocks. After each, it came down, though not to as far as it had been. It's painful to bring inflation down. So we had the early supply shocks around the time of OPEC 1, the later supply shock around the time of OPEC 2, and now we've got double-digit inflation. And then came Paul Volcker, who, come hell or high water, he was going to bring inflation down. And he did.
Nominal aggregate demand was rising.
Nominal aggregate demand almost always goes up. Yeah. It's true. You have to have one whopper of a recession to bring that down. Now, that's true. There's somebody way up at the back. I think so, otherwise you won't be heard. But you're young, you can climb the stairs easily. If you just spoke from back there, nobody would hear you.
Not certain anybody will hear me down here either. Hi. So this bit about central bank independence. Recently, there's been a trend in political science literature that says, there's something of a dilemma here, right? The more independent the central bank is, the more they can do their job, but the less democratic legitimacy this system has. Do you think this is a relevant concern? And if so, how would you, what's your thoughts on this dilemma?
Yes, I do think it's a very relevant concern. There's a broad question. I talk to my students. I teach a graduate course in the spring about this a lot, about what decisions should be left in the realm of technocracy and what should be left in the realm of politics. I was going to say something, my general view. Forget about that. Let's stick with this. I think there's a very good case to keep monetary policy in the realm of technocracy, having to do with long lags until you see the effects, the technical nature of the decisions and what politics would do. You know, kings have been clipping the currency since the beginning of kings, and we know that doesn't work out so well. So I think there's a very good case for that. But, and this is the political science part, and why that's reasonable, you don't want to extend that too much. You don't want to start giving the Federal Reserve authority over all kinds of things where the political actors ought to have the authority. So the arrangement we have, which I think is pretty good, maybe not perfect, but pretty good, is the Fed has enormous unchecked power in a very small range. And I'm personally happy with that, and so are most economists. That's not an idiosyncratic view. I think most economists would be perfectly happy with that. That's how you square the circle.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor. Quick set of questions, sort of related. First is, in the current climate, the Fed is obviously trying to tame inflation. What's your sense, given your expertise in history and empirical records, what's your sense of how the Fed is set up to be successful or not? And a somewhat related, but not necessarily related follow-up question, I don't know if you're familiar, hopefully you were, the researcher at the Bank of England last year or so came up with this great chart showing 800 years of interest rates and a generally declining rate, sort of disinflation for the super long term. I mean, the error could be 10 or you could be off by measured in decades, so you have to be careful with it. But I'm wondering how, if at all, that factors into anything we should be thinking about generally, perhaps beyond the next business cycle.
Let me give you a brief answer to that second question. There is a long-term, now, in America, we don't have 800 years worth of data, but there is a long downward trend in interest rates, interrupted right now. And it has been interrupted at times in the past, but since Volcker, say, there's been a pronounced downward trend in interest rates. Some of it, as you just said, is due to lower inflation. Some of it is lower real interest rates. That's the interest rate minus the inflation rate. Both have been trending down. I'm not going to try to give a full exegesis of why that is. That would make a very long-winded answer to your question. On the first, the Powell Fed now has a difficult job. It's not quite as difficult as you might think in the popular press. If you read the popular press, it sounds like we've got an 8% inflation rate, he has to bring it down to 2%. That sounds comparable to what Paul Volcker did in the 80s. Well, first of all, the 8% is the consumer, I'm getting wonkish now, but you asked. The 8% inflation rate is the consumer price index, which always rose above the index that the Fed targets, which is the PCE. I'm sorry. If you don't know what PCE is, forget about it. That one has got a 6 handle on it, not an 8 handle on it. Secondly, the Federal Reserve has precious little, I would say zero, control over food prices, energy prices, and supply chain problems. Add all those up, and you're probably talking about 2 or more percentage points of inflation, which takes that 6 handle down to a 4 handle. So the Federal Reserve's job, the Powell's job, is to bring it down from 4 something to 2 something, hopefully to 2. I don't think they're going to be that fussy about hitting 2.0, but get it down into the 2 range. So already you see that it's not as hard a job as Volcker had, which is not to say it's an easy job. This FOMC is trying to achieve what is hard to achieve, but not impossible, and that's another part of my book that I didn't talk about today, a so-called soft landing. That is, pull some of the steam out of the economy, but not so much that you cause a recession. Will they achieve that? I'd say the odds are against them. But it's not like the odds are 25 to 1 against them. I'm not sure what the odds are. The chances they can pull it off are less than 50%, for sure. But certainly not 0. And I'm rooting for them. We're all rooting for them to do that. But we're going to require deft handling of monetary policy and, frankly, some good luck. They've had a lot of bad luck of late. I mean, this is one of the lesser casualties of the invasion of Ukraine. There are much more deeper, more serious, horrible problems caused by that. But one problem for the U.S. economy is that shot up energy prices and it shot up food prices and made the Fed's job harder. So it's a tough job, but I wouldn't call it impossible. I should have looked over here. I didn't. Yeah. There's a mic down here on this aisle.
Hi, thank you. I just had a quick question. I was wondering, what do you think was the rationale for keeping interest rates basically 0 when inflation was 2-3% from, obviously way after the financial crisis from 2013 or to 18 or 19, while continuing quantitative easing? And the follow-up is, do you think that was a policy error or not? Thank you.
I don't think most of it was a policy error, but recently. So the rationale is basically worries about insecurity over the durability of the recovery. So I think your question started back in 2013. The Fed, in the crisis of 2008-9, dropped the rate to almost 0, and then it held it there for 7 years, I think. Worried that the economy might falter, and B, looking at really low inflation rates. You may have forgotten this, but for years the Fed was worrying that it couldn't get inflation up to 2%. Now it's trying to get inflation down to 2%. But for years it couldn't get it up to 2%. It was trying to give the economy a boost. And so it was using super low interest rates and other things to try to accomplish that. Do I think that was right? Yeah. Yes and no. It was literally right. Inflation was below 2%, and their target was 2, so you want to push it up. If you ask me, was it really a big national problem that inflation was averaging 1.7% instead of 2.0? I think you can tell by the way I said it what my answer is. I mean, who can tell the difference between 1.7 and 2? So I don't think it was that important, but that was the reason. Now, when you come to the policy era, inflation, here's something people easily forget. It's not that long ago. This high inflation that we're suffering with now only started 1.5 years ago. You only have to go back 1.5 years to find inflation below 2%. So it's not that long. The Fed should have started raising interest rates earlier, but not 2 years ago, not even a year and a half ago. So one can argue about when they should have. So it is a policy mistake, I said that. They did wait too long. And again, they were worried about the strength of the recovery from the pandemic recession. That was a whopper. It really sent the economy down not just one flight of stairs, but like 4 flights of stairs. And they did what they could to help push the economy up. But, you know, running all the way into 2021, they were still worried about the strength of the recovery. And that's what led them to this policy error. Right here.
Thank you. You had noted that during the Reagan years, the deficits was one of the drivers behind the decline of U.S. manufacturing.
Behind the decline of?
U.S. manufacturing?
Yes.
Do you have any opinions on whether the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act can and or will help U.S. manufacturing?
I think it will, yes, a little. Some of it is subsidizing some of these activities. The CHIPS Act is more germane. That's really going to subsidize the manufacture of semiconductors in the United States. So those things do have effect. That's industrial policy, which most of us economists are not thrilled about, because that means you're giving politicians a lot of authority over decisions that capitalists are supposed to make. But, you know, I don't want to push that to the limit, especially given what we saw in recently about disruptions of supply chains that cross national borders. There, you know, if you ask me the question, should we make sure that we produce PPE in the United States of America now, given what we learned? My answer is yes. And if it takes the government to do that, the government should do it, which is probably not what I would have said 2 years ago. But, so a little bit, but the dollar exchange rate's going up again. That's what did. It was much bigger back in the Reagan period, the rise of the dollar. But the dollar exchange rate's going up again, enough to notice. And that is probably going to damage, again, American manufacturing.
Thank you.
Right here.
Thanks very much, Professor. So you framed this story by talking about the conflict about who got to be first fiddle, monetary or fiscal policy. And one of the questions that occurred to me, and your last response kind of touches upon this, is another story here is the growing consensus that those were the two fiddles, monetary and fiscal policy. And you touched on a couple more, price controls, industrial policy, labor market policy is another one. So I wonder if you could comment on how that became the consensus and whether you think that's unraveling.
Yeah. Let me be clear that this whole talk is about monetary and fiscal policy, about stabilization policy, about macroeconomic policy, the size of the economy, the state of aggregate demand. That's not the only issue there is. By no means is it the only issue there is. Let me just tick off a few really big ones that are not going to be solved by monetary and fiscal policy. Climate change, huge problem, worldwide problem, but also including here. Income inequality, huge problem, not in every country, but in many countries, and certainly in the United States of America. Now that is fiscal policy of a sort, but it's not what I mean. The term of art fiscal policy is not about that. You could say it's fiscal policy because a lot of it may be about taxes and transfers and things like that, but some of it is not about taxes and transfers. It's about training and income support and many other things like that. So I didn't mean to denigrate any of those. It's just not the topic. It's not what this book is about. I have written about some of those in other occasions and have talked about them on other occasions, but it's just not what this book is about.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, you said there was a lot of confusion in monetary policy during the 70s. So I guess the question is, did when the U.S. went off the gold standard, I guess in 71, and the Bretton Woods era came to an end, did that have any effect on the conduct of monetary policy at all?
Yeah,
positive
probably.
or negative?
Yes, I think it did. Michael is shaking his head. He thinks even more than I think, but I think it did. The gold exchange system, the Bretton Woods system, imposed a kind of discipline on central banks around the world. But the reason that I shouldn't speak for Michael. The reason that I don't put it on the paramount list of things that led to inflation thereafter for the United States is it put less discipline on us than anybody else. Because under the Bretton Woods system, other countries had to maintain their exchange rate with the United States. That's what they had to do. The United States didn't, really. We weren't on a gold standard where the Fed could not create more money unless it had the gold. That was way, way earlier. So there was some discipline on American monetary policy, mainly because, to use my analogy again, we were playing first violin in the orchestra, and the rest of the advanced world was going to have to follow us. And if we had any sense of responsibility, we didn't want to jump into the inflationary blue yonder, because that would drag France and Germany and Italy and Canada and everybody else along with us. So there was some discipline which then disappeared when Nixon took us off the Bretton Woods system, but not super. I think most of the discipline then and now came from people not liking inflation. If you let inflation go high, the public opinion is going to turn against you, as Joe Biden. As I said, I think Joe Biden was a minor player in that, but he happens to be sitting in the chair at the time. The public gets angry with you. This is not Brazil. In Brazil, an 8% inflation is nothing. In Turkey now, an 8% inflation is, God, I wish we had 8% inflation. But Americans don't like inflation. We're a low inflation country in our history. The average inflation rate since the Civil War is about 1-point-something%. Since the Civil War. We're a low inflation country, and the people want it to be a low inflation country. And that, along with central bank independence, so you have a Federal Reserve that has the power and the authority to pull inflation down if it gets high, is why we have. That's the real discipline on the inflation rate, not the Bretton Woods system, I believe. One last question, I guess. Huh? How are we doing on time? We're okay.
The inflation rate, I think was originally measured by the Labor Department in
Still is.
the First World War. Is when it started to happen. And from what I understand, they use all domestic. They'd go to cities and take baskets of goods and measure, and then they'd, I think, average them all together and come up with a rate. And it seems that there's a lot of international deflationary pressure on the American economy, that the inflationary measurements have really little accuracy of measuring.
So two things about that. One is that imported goods show up that are bought by Americans, show up in stores. Walmart's full of them, but it's not just Walmart. And they get priced into the Consumer Price Index. So it doesn't have to be made in America to get into the Consumer Price Index. The foreign stuff is in there. Secondly, what you just said about deflationary pressures from the rest of the world, that's not the world we're living in now. Among advanced countries, we're on the low end of the inflation rate. We're not super low. We have high inflation. But most of the countries you would think of as being in our peer group have somewhat higher inflation than we do, the notable exception being Japan. which is much lower and has for a long time. But for the most part, if foreign influences on American inflation now are nudging inflation up, not down. We should give May the last question. You're right next to a mic there.
Thank you very much, Alan. Can I sit down?
Of course you can sit down.
Well, he was sitting down. Do you think that the pandemic stimulus package was too generous, too large? Because I was surprised to see that it's 10% of GDP, compared to 5% of GDP with the 2008 stimulus package. I remember many economists at the time say that the QE should have been twice as big.
Right.
And now this time we did it exactly twice as big.
Yep.
But at the very same time, we're having very bad supply chain issues,
Yes.
which translates into a decrease in the supply. And so you have a lot of new
Right.
money into the economy, but with lowering supply, and so you have then it become and consumers were spending that money on
Goods.
yeah, a consumer what is that, like washing machines, dishwashers, ovens, that kind of thing, consumer durables. I think Paul Krugman said that, and that drive up the demand, right? So then you have created a situation where you have a demand pull and price-led inflation.
Right. Too
So
much money chasing too few goods.
Right, exactly. So my question really is, do you think that we shouldn't have done that much, spend that much money? I got $1,400 into my bank account. It just showed up.
No, you didn't. You were above the income limit, but anyway. I didn't get that check.
You didn't, but, I don't know what happened, right? So there was $1,400 in my, I didn't need it, nor did I apply for it, but it was there. And it didn't say who deposited it. So I figured it must be the stimulus.
Let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, you want to separate the fiscal stimulus into at least two tranches. The CARES Act in 2020, that was the 10% of GDP. I certainly don't think that was too big. We were in a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe, a health catastrophe, an economic catastrophe, every kind of catastrophe you could think of. And importantly, to the rest of the way you asked your question, May, it was concentrated on the demand side. People were not going shopping. They were afraid to go shopping or the store was closed. And the big need, dwarfing everything else, was to boost demand, to get back to a more normal economy. The 2021 American Rescue Package, I don't go around advertising this because I'm a supporter of Joe Biden. I think it was too big. We didn't need it that big. We needed one. It was appropriate to have another one. Among other things, we hadn't finished the health job, just to name one. But it was probably too big and made a contribution to too much money chasing too few goods. But I think that was tiny compared to the other things that were going on at the time. And just to finish in another sentence or so, you were talking about the supply chains. What happens when people in an economy can't or don't want to buy services anymore, like go to the barber and the restaurant and things like that, and want to spend their money on goods? You need more ships, you need more containers, you need more cardboard boxes, you need more trucks, you need more people working on the ports, you need more trucks and truckers, and it takes time. So at first the situation created tremendous these are what the supply chain problems are. A surge in demand for goods that takes time to adapt to. Markets do adapt, but one reason that members of Team Transitory, and I was one, were wrong is that it took longer to adapt than we thought. I say, when I speak about that subject, I often say my era was excessive belief in capitalism. I thought the capitalists would rush right in there and make a lot of money by these gaps. They are, but it's slow. And that's really a much bigger cause of inflation, I think, than the fact that the 2021 stimulus was probably too big.
Thank you very much, Alan. Great.